So let's get started. Thanks for coming. We're very excited to have Kaitlyn Robinson and Martha Crenshaw back at CSAC. Martha was here as a senior fellow until 2019. Kaitlyn got her PhD here in 2022 and is now in the midst of her first year teaching as an assistant professor at Rice. And they've been working on very data-informed project on transnational and local terrorist groups for a while now. We're excited to see what you guys have come up with. So, well, you're going to talk for like 45 minutes, and we'll go to you guys.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's nice. I think I speak for both of us to be back. This conference room is very familiar, certainly to me, having sat out there in the audience for many years. So we'll go to the next one. This is part of a larger project, and we're about to launch our new website, mappingmilitants.org. You can look at it now if you want to. Essentially, we trace the development over time of a number of different militant groups, armed non-state actors, and you can find out more simply by going to the website. It is a project that's funded by the Department of Homeland Security through a consortium at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And of course, we don't represent the Department of Homeland Security whatsoever. We're not representing the views of any government agency. The Mapping Militants Project was originally funded by the Department of Defense through the Minerva Initiative, but again, we don't represent their points of view.
Great. So we want to kind of situate our study today about transnational terrorism with a major attack that happened in July 2010, carried out by the group Al-Shabaab. So Al-Shabaab is originally a Somali group, and in July 2010, they launched 2 suicide bombings against crowds watching streams of the attacks killed 74 and injured 5. They were pretty large, substantial attacks committed by it. So these attacks were widely conceptualized as a retaliation for the presence of forces in Somalia. And so these numbers here show just kind of an increasing internationalization of the Somali conflict, both in the number of troops, but also the number of people. Given this level of foreign involvement, Martha and I thought that it was kind of rather puzzling that Al-Shabaab would go to trouble to commit an attack outside of the country. In other words, why attack abroad when there are so many foreign enemies already at home? Why would you spend the resources, the intelligence, the time to plan this sort of attack? And so this motivates this broader project that seeks to understand when do insurgencies go abroad. Al-Shabaab is not alone in this. So using some data from the UCP, we find that about 30% of rebel groups that are active since 1999 engaged in at least one violent attack abroad. And this is rather surprising for folks who study insurgencies. We think about them as mostly domestic processes, about domestic grievances, but rather many of these actors are engaging in some sort of transnational activity. So this motivates 2 research questions that we'll try to answer today. First, when and why do some militant groups attack outside of their local conflict ecosystems? And second, at what point in the group's campaign does it start to initiate in these transnational attacks? In other words, what changes? What might cause a domestic insurgency to move abroad? To just briefly preview our argument, we're going to hope to make the case that international ties matter. So these changes in the types of international ties that groups have abroad are going to influence that activity abroad. And this is mostly because these alliances and affiliations can shape the costs and benefits of transnational violence. In particular, they motivate more attacks abroad, and then they also lower the logistical barriers of actually carrying out that violence. So in the talk today, we'll put forward this argument and draw on 2 pieces of evidence to support it. We'll rely on a cross-national data set of violence and group relationships to kind of talk about larger patterns, but we'll also do a deep dive into the Al-Shabaab case study that sort of motivated this project. Our main findings are twofold. So first, we find that groups with international ties are more likely to initiate their first attacks abroad much earlier on in their campaigns compared to groups that lack those ties. And second, we find just broad evidence, particularly in the al-Shabaab case, that these international ties shape a group's internal desire and their ability to attack abroad. So it affects both kind of the motivation and the logistical capacity to do that.
So our question, why do groups attack abroad? And as usual, we embarked on a sort of literature review to ask what other people had said about this particular question. And in general, what we found that there were several arguments that were put forward, that there are benefits of transnational violence. And one is a demonstration of resolve, a sort of reputational sort of issue that you demonstrate that you're able to act, that you have resolve, you have the capabilities to extend violence abroad. There's a high degree of propaganda value, particularly attacks on civilian targets, particularly in urban areas, particularly in countries with a relatively free press where there can be a lot of reporting, particularly in countries that already get a lot of reporting. So there's certainly advantages there. And of course, one of the other arguments is that the attacks abroad are meant to impose costs on foreign intervention forces. Again, getting us back to our initial question, well, you can attack those forces at home. There are plenty of them in Somalia. Why would you be creating pressure by going abroad? At the same time, attacking outside one's home territory is generally harder to do, logistically harder. It's more complicated, it's more complex. You can sort of imagine all the difficulties. You might not have local support networks. You got to transport people across borders, weapons across borders, bombs across borders. And often you might incur reputational costs. You might incur some opprobrium by attacking civilians. Kampala, just people gathered outside watching the World Cup on television. Again, high publicity is both a benefit and it can be a detriment to your cause. And of course, if you move outside and you start attacking major targets outside, instead of deterring international intervention, you might just invite more international intervention. And we might add parenthetically, especially American intervention. So there are two other explanations out there that have to do more with sort of group level type factors, organizational factors within the group. And one argument that's been proposed quite recently is that groups attack abroad when they're weak, that attacking abroad is a high risk, high reward strategy for a group. So if you think you're losing at home and you're sort of gambling for resurrection, you mount an attack abroad to show you're still in the game, to demonstrate that you're actually strong, to keep the movement alive. We're going to disagree with this particular theory as we go through this. Just a little preview, you just empirically, you really don't see this association, but we can delve into that later. And a third idea there is that it's when you're being repressed at home. You can't get anywhere at home. You can't get anywhere against the local military, whoever is there, preventing you from acting. And the state's not making concessions. You're not getting what you want. You're frustrated at home, and you think you might as well go outside. You can see that those two arguments are really not incompatible at all, although they come from different sources. Now, our view is that this may be part of it, although, as I say, we're dubious about the weakness hypothesis in general. Indeed, I think we would probably come down on the other side of that. But what we see is that these sorts of theories that we run across really can't explain why things change over time. They can't explain why a group would start or end attacks abroad, why they're not constant, why they occur at certain points over time in a conflict. And as we all know, it's really difficult to capture change over time when you look at the activities of these groups, particularly in the kinds of databases that we have available to us. And our argument is that these groups don't operate in a vacuum. From the beginning of the Mapping Militants Project, we've argued that states usually face a whole galaxy of opponents, a cluster of opponents, and that groups are operating in this sort of setting, both at home and abroad. You have to take into account alliances that they might form across national borders. So basically, the argument is that these alliances and affiliations, and I will say we're focusing here on positive relationships with groups outside the conflict zone rather than rivalries, which is something that we will conclude by saying we would like to be able to get to that because it plays a role. We just don't get to it here, that they can affect organizational characteristics and affect the propensity and the capability to attack abroad. So for example, there are theories that these ties abroad can improve a group's capabilities. They can be more lethal. I think this has been shown by the authors that we've cited here. And there can be, if there are these alliances and affiliations, there's going to be more sharing of tactics, more sharing of expertise. For example, how to construct very effective suicide bombs. Bomb making is a very high level technical capability of a group. Trainers are often sent from one group to another to assist in bomb making instructions, as well as general training in terms of military tactics, how to conduct attacks. It's just quite a tangible sort of assistance. And so what we're saying is that if there are these outside alliances, affiliations, cooperative relationships that we say, it could lead groups to increase their attacks abroad, to intensify attacks abroad, to launch attacks abroad when they had not done so before.
So basically, our argument states that these international alliances and affiliations, which we'll call international ties, are going to shape the reputational and material calculus of these groups when they're deciding whether or not to attack abroad. And as Martha was saying in the last slide, some ways that this can happen. So first, they might shift goals or ideology of the group. So for example, becoming an Al-Qaeda affiliate might expand a group's conception of the enemy. It might see foreigners as new enemies or as legitimate targets and decide to attack beyond its borders. Additionally, these international ties can increase resources. So they might attract foreign fighters or foreign sources of funding, which help the group develop further capabilities and attack outside of its borders. Additionally, this could also lead to an increase in expertise. So as Martha was saying, can facilitate the sharing of military trainers, also tactics, spreading across groups and across borders. And together, these sorts of observations generate this expectation that we'll try to provide evidence for today, that groups with international alliances and affiliations will engage in transnational violence earlier on in their campaigns compared to groups without these ties. And the logic behind this is basically that these groups have these various resources available to them. They have the motivation and the capacity. And so if they have those sorts of connections, then they'll engage in transnational violence at kind of a quicker rate is what we're thinking. So in order to assess this expectation, we take kind of a multi-method approach. First, we deal with some cross-national data on rebel violence and relationships, and we're going to take a survival model to try to get at the idea of at what point in a group's campaign do these transnational attacks really start. We'll supplement this with a case study of al-Shabaab, which will highlight how al-Shabaab kind of developed internationalized goals and a strategy of attacking abroad and kind of folded it in to its own Somali identity. So for our data here, we'll rely on two major data sets. The first, we're going to draw from the UCDP georeferenced event data set. So the logic behind doing this is this set of groups is kind of widely considered to be the insurgencies of the world. And rather than focusing on just terrorist groups, we want to look at groups, that have some sort of incompatibility with a home government and see when they attack outside of those borders where that incompatibility is. So we define a rebel home here as the country where the first incompatibility with a government actor took place, and anything that is any violence that directed at a different actor, so whether that's civilians outside of these borders or a government actor outside these borders, we're going to code as transnational violence or attacks abroad. We'll then rely on the militant group alliances and rivalries data set. So this is a relatively new data set that came out in IO a few years ago. They use the Mapping Militants Project for a lot of their coding, so we were pleased with that shout out. But they measure the presence of a variety of ties. And so we're going to focus just on alliance and affiliations with other non-state actors. And we'll use the same kind of home and abroad coding. So an international tie will be an alliance or an affiliation with a militant group operating outside the home zone of a particular rebel group. So before we dive into the empirics, I just want to give like a brief overview of some interesting descriptives. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we were kind of surprised by the number of rebels that engage in transnational violence. So we found that about 30% of these groups that are active since 1989 attacked abroad at least once. And so, typically what comes to mind when this transnational violence occurs, you might think the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, but there's also some other actors in there that kind of surprised us. So the IRA is a large perpetrator of transnational violence, the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army from Uganda, various Kurdish groups. It is pretty distinct and diverse in terms of aim and identity among the perpetrators of this violence abroad.
Is the IRA attacking London? Is that abroad or not?
Well, I knew you would ask that, Jim. They've actually attacked in the Netherlands, in Ireland, and in the US. That's a valid question because after direct rule was imposed, Northern Ireland was part of the UK.
So breaking it down by civilians and government. So a lot of this violence is happening against government targets. And we see kind of a large spike in that. But we were puzzled by what's going on actually in the civilian section of this. So we zoom in and there's this interesting trend that's happening in the last 10 years or so, where the number of attacks against civilians are kind of equal rates committed by groups at home and committed by groups abroad. And we think what's happening here, most of this is probably driven by the Islamic State attacking kind of outside of its home boundaries and extending its own particular franchises. But it's a puzzling finding that we were just very interested in descriptively, and we're going to look more into. So getting back to kind of the main focus of this part of the project, we want to know when do groups start attacking abroad, and we take this Cox proportional hazards model setup. Here, conceptually, the kind of death in the Cox proportional hazards model language is going to be a group's first attack abroad. So you can think about the DV here as being the time until attacking abroad. Then we'll include a dummy variable for any sort of international alliance or affiliation. And so I'm not counting the number, we're just counting any sort of tie abroad, and we'll see if that has a relationship. We include some controls. We stratify by country to allow for different baseline hazards, to allow some flexibility in the model to control for these kind of country-specific features. And generally what we find is that international ties are associated with a kind of faster time till death in this model. So groups that have international ties are much more likely to initiate attacks abroad sooner on in their campaigns. We find that the hazard for these sorts of groups is about 7 times higher than groups without these ties, which is quite substantively large. So then we turn to the case of Al-Shabaab to kind of understand the mechanism that is driving what exactly might be going on here.
Again, Al-Shabaab is a really interesting and rich case to analyze, in part because there's quite a lot of material on it because it's such an important conflict and an important conflict for the United States. And also Al-Shabaab has shown just remarkable longevity. It survived the decapitation strikes by the US on at least 3 of its leaders. Each time they've managed to survive the strike, to go on indeed to become stronger and even more active. So overall, it was an interesting case. And as Katie has pointed out, there's so many states that have intervened, which we're going to show. There's so many foreign militaries now. Recent Al-Shabaab attacks killed some Ukrainians who were with a UN mission. It's the plethora of foreign targets is really unusual. And of course, the number of their really spectacular major attacks outside the country is also unusual. It stands out. What we want to argue is that Al-Qaeda Al-Qaeda was, I would say, a sort of lodestar for the beginnings of Al-Shabaab from the very beginning, but it was only over time that these ties began to really develop and become tangible and become firmer and more concrete. So within Al-Shabaab, you see a process of what we call radicalization, in the sense of it becomes more and more extreme in the sense of being allied with Al-Qaeda and adopting their goals in terms of pursuing not just an Islamic state, but for example, extreme hostility toward other religions, very strict rules about dress and social behavior, and other sorts of prescriptions and proscriptions advocated by Al-Qaeda. And what you find is that the development of the alliance, and as it deepens, the more and more leadership struggles within Al-Shabaab. So forming the international alliance is not cost-free in terms of group cohesion. But every time there's a big leadership struggle with purges and defections and mergers and splinters, the Al-Qaeda affiliates come out on top somehow. So over time, the group moves from a group that originally had more nationalist, domestic sorts of aspirations to one that is increasingly dominated by international aspirations. It was only in 2012 that Al-Shabaab became a formal affiliate, pledged bayat to Al-Qaeda. That was not because they didn't want to. They had been reaching out quite obviously and openly for some time. But interestingly enough, it was only after the death of bin Laden and Zawahiri's ascension to power over Al-Qaeda that Al-Qaeda accepted Al-Shabaab, which is an interesting part of the dynamic that we haven't quite figured out yet. They also, as part of this kind of internationalization, developed aspirations to be apparently a regional power. And they began to develop networks and operatives within Kenya itself to use the Muslim minority, particularly within Kenya, although there are Muslim minorities in other neighboring states, to create operational networks that would permit them to attack more effectively, more efficiently within Kenya. They wouldn't have to move people and armaments across. So the most recent suicide bombing in Kenya was, I believe, a Kenyan national as opposed to Somali nationals or Somali residents of Kenya. And I should also add parenthetically, we focused a lot on the major attacks, but if you look at ACLED data, for example, there are constant minor attacks in Kenya. So there are many, many more attacks than appear in the news in terms of what Al-Shabaab is doing in the region. So as I say, here you have increasing internationalization of Al-Shabaab, and at the same time you have increasing number of foreign troops and foreign actors involved. We won't go through a long list of the various intervention coalitions that were formed by the African Union, by the UN, but the number of countries involved in sending troops and the number of troops involved in Somalia grows constantly over time. And as we've pointed out, while all this is transpiring, more and more troops are moving into the country. Al-Qaeda is becoming more internationalist while we're all trying to defeat them in Somalia. So over time, as we've said, the leadership becomes more militant, and the new leaders, for example, particularly the successors to Godani, who was only the second Al-Shabaab leader who was killed in an airstrike in these cases. Basically, over time, as these leaders seize power, they eliminate dissenting voices within the organization who would have argued more for a national Somalia level focus. So they're able to become more internationalist because they're removing the alternative leadership and voices within the organization. So it's sort of an exit voice and loyalty sort of situation. They adopted the use of suicide tactics from an early date. They perfected those. As you can see, they issued video appeals to Al-Qaeda. And as we've said, they purged members of the group who were opposed to any sort of affiliation. I'd say they're not very many anymore. These were very serious purges leading to the physical removal of opponents within the organization. So here are just some headlines. As you can see, these are just some of the major attacks that made headlines all over the world. The first one in Kampala, the next one, an attack on the Westgate Mall in Kenya. Probably you remember this. They used a tactic of not just a major attack on a target, but a siege, holding people hostage for a long period of time. And this creates even more publicity. It's a very valuable tactic from the point of view of gaining publicity. An assault on a university in Kenya, which was a largely Christian university within Kenya. and they distinguished between Muslims and Christians and killed the Christians at the university. And then a later attack in 2019 at a major hotel in Kenya. It's a particularly interesting attack because in general, al-Shabaab justifies all their attacks as retaliation for military intervention. This particular attack, they said it was retaliation for the US moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But there was a problem with that argument, which is that the planning for the attack began well before the US decided to move the embassy. And also the hotel was owned by Thai nationals. It's a Thai conglomerate, so it wasn't American or Israeli. So here we have, you can see this sort of increasing number of attacks against civilian targets over time. You see peaks, and you also see government targets, and you can see clearly that although there are a large number of attacks against civilians, this doesn't mean that there's a sort of substitution effect. They're still attacking government targets, whether military or civilian. Say the Ministry of Education was one of their major targets. They're against Western education. And most recently, just showing how active they still are and how much of a threat they still pose. In 2020, they attacked a Kenyan military base, Manda Bay, in Kenya, and killed 3 American military personnel who were at the base. But in 2023, the United States identified the perpetrator, and he was killed in either an airstrike or a drone strike. Just recently, earlier this year, they seized a UN helicopter that it was, I think, at least the second time they had seized a UN helicopter, killed at least 1 person, and I think are still holding the others hostage, including the Ukrainians, some Emiratis, some other nationals who are there in intervention. So again, intensification of their international focus all the time, leading to internal organizational changes that cement that focus, make it impossible to go back. And certainly we think the relationship with al-Qaeda helped shape their activities abroad, increase their ambition, made it valuable to them to attack abroad in ways that would not have been the case otherwise.
So just to wrap up, we hope to have convinced you that international ties matter. We think they matter for understanding when and why these insurgent groups attack beyond their kind of home conflict locations. This project is kind of in the beginning stages, and so we'd love to hear thoughts about kind of how we can expand. Paths that Martha and I have discussed, one is moving obviously beyond the case of Somalia and thinking about some of the internal dynamics that might be driving groups in other contexts to carry out attacks abroad. There's also a lot of variation in targets and tactics. So the most obvious one is civilians versus government targets, but we might also think about use of different tactics, such as suicide attacks. This kind of folds into our next point, is that we need to think about failed or foiled attacks, particularly if it is very logistically challenging to carry out these attacks abroad. We could be missing out on a variety of events that don't make it in this data set because they're not successful. Additionally, we'd like to consider the role of negative relationships. So rivalries is kind of the main one here, and what role that might play in a group's calculus to move abroad. And then finally, as kind of shown by the case of al-Shabaab, leadership turnover is really important, and this kind of internal turmoil or splintering or disagreement, and this can play a role in affecting a group's choice to move abroad, but also its ability to sustain that violence abroad. And so we're working on thinking about how that might interact with the role that international ties play in sort of motivating this violence. So that's all we have today. Thanks so much for having us, and we're looking forward to your comments.
Okay, thanks. That was great and very efficiently done, which is good. So I think the practice is to begin with CSAC fellow questions. So yes, could you tell us who you are?
I am Josh Glonick, a visiting scholar here at CSAC and a member of the U.S. military. Thank you for your presentation today. I've just got a couple questions for you. At first, I'm very intrigued about this, the way you're referring to attacks as being abroad, really wanting to more fully understand what you mean by abroad, because of course, many insurgencies are not necessarily isolated to one particular country. You know, some of the classic ones like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State across many states, but even a group like Boko Haram, where I would imagine you would classify Nigeria as sort of their home state, frequently conducts attacks in other areas in the Lake Chad Basin. So if they're conducting an attack into Niger or Chad and you classify that as abroad, I would argue that's sort of a misclassification because that's still sort of their home turf. So I'm just wondering how you account for, what the definition of abroad is. And then secondly, not all insurgencies are created equal. And so, some of them are more transnational in nature in their creation and their objectives. Al-Qaeda, is sort of a classic example. So the fact that they conduct an attack abroad against the United States on 9/11 isn't really a puzzle to me because that's what they're intended to do. Whereas other groups are much more local in nature that are opposing a particular political regime in a state. Them conducting attack abroad is much more interesting, but I'm wondering how you separate out those groups that are sort of transnational by design versus those are more local in creation. Thanks.
Want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I'll go backwards. So your first question, your second question about kind of group goals. Yeah. So one way that I've been thinking about it is like there are kind of groups that are like born abroad in the sense that they're created in order, they basically have foreign enemies at their start. And that seems very different from the type of groups that are purely formed for domestic insurgency and have kind of one internal enemy. And so what we've been thinking about is like classifying these groups by types of goals. So something we try to do in like the Cox model, for example, is control for like if a group is nationalist, we might not think that they have enemies abroad. We could also maybe think about like communist groups or other sorts of like ideologies and how those ideologies might be internationalized or not. But we haven't really distinguished in the theory whether or not those goals make a difference. I guess one thing that we could do going forward is just descriptively see what types of groups are engaging in this sort of violence and whether or not that falls kind of with the expectation that like domestic goals or objectives are kind of more of these domestic groups.
I think the first part of your question, what is abroad? What's at home and what's abroad? And that is obviously a very thorny question. And I think most of the data sets we've used in the empirical analysis we've done, national borders, and those might not be the borders that the group in question regards as legitimate borders. They might have universal sorts of goals like Al-Qaeda. They might have regional. They might just have sort of bilateral goals, thinking that another country ought to be part of their territory. So we had to use just a simple definition that's crossed the national border. As I replied to Jim at the outset, technically when Northern Ireland is part of England, part of the UK, part of Great Britain, you wouldn't say that's across a national border, even though the IRA thinks of itself as belonging to another country and not belonging to the country it's attacking. But as I said, they have attacked in countries that clearly were not the target country. And similarly, what about transnational groups that are transnational from the origins, from the outset, like Al-Qaeda, that perhaps it began by wanting to overthrow the government of Saudi Arabia? I think one could argue that, but very quickly is displaced outside and its goals are very quickly, completely transnational. And so I thought that probably we would be asked, well, Al-Shabaab, sure, it's because it signed on to Al-Qaeda. What would you expect? So I tried to think of some other examples. And what I thought of was the Palestinian groups in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and their relationships with the West European revolutionary groups, the Red Army faction, other groups, and the ways in which they began to collaborate and the ways in which their collaboration, the alliance that was formed between these groups, I think had it had a strong impact on both of them in terms of their capabilities of acting abroad. The alliances also created internal dissent. For example, the French groups, at least according to their own account of their decision making, were sort of invited to join this Palestinian Western European alliance. And they realized that if they did so, if they accepted aid from the Palestinian groups, particularly the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they could, for example, attend training camps in the Middle East, which would be very valuable to them. But the price to be paid was that the Palestinian groups chose the targets, and they were usually Jewish or Israeli targets. And according again to the memoirs of the leaders and interviews with them in France, we didn't want to pay that price to join this alliance, even though it would have strengthened us in order to do so. So to me, that's another case that would get us out of the Al-Qaeda orbit into a different kind of ideological framework. And I suppose there you could argue, well, the Palestinians as well were always displaced from a local spot. They couldn't attack Israel from within Israel, so they are exclusively abroad. But we are trying to think of some other examples to get away from sort of just the natural conclusion that, well, if they're allied with Al-Qaeda, of course, this is the price of admission to Al-Qaeda. And while I'm on that, I'll just add another question or puzzle for myself, which is that al-Shabaab is stuck with Al-Qaeda, although Al-Qaeda is declining in importance. And we've only referred briefly to the rivalry with ISIS, particularly in Africa, but that's a part of this equation as well that we want to be able to account for. As we said, we don't have a lot of data yet on rivalries, but we certainly think that it was interesting to me that al-Shabaab has, by and large, except for some little splitting, stuck with Al-Qaeda, even though it's weaker over time. So there's still, in other words, there's a whole lot to explore there. And we're glad to have thoughts on how we deal with it.
Great. We're going to go back to CSAC Fellows, but Herb Lynn has a question which fits right here. He says, how, if at all, does your analysis relate to the activities of Hamas, especially its attack on Israel across the Gaza border? What would it be a transnational attack or not? I'm going to guess you say that's not a transnational attack.
No, yeah, because I think UCDP codes the first incompatibility as with Israel. So in the data, it's not a transnational attack. I mean, conceptually, we can talk about whether or not it should be a transnational attack, but it's, yeah.
Okay, good. CSAC Fellows? Yes. Can you say, you?
Thank you for your presentation, Claude Lambert, Army War College fellow, visiting scholar here at CSAC. I have a question about your path forward with this project, some cases beyond Somalia. Are you looking at, just curious if you're looking at exploring the Houthi rebel group, and there seems like that'd be a intriguing case study of variation in targets and attacks, tactics now. They really have like state-like capabilities, ballistic missile attacks on the Red Sea shipping channels, as well as they launched a ballistic missile to Israel that is considered the first combat space action in space, because that intercept it was intercepted by an Israel Arrow missile defense system in low Earth orbit. So that's just a pretty intriguing case study that would nest well with your project going forward. Just curious.
Well, actually, one of our projects in the works that we aim to complete as we go into next year is that we have a map, quote unquote, by which we mean a diagram of alliances and relationships of all the groups that are linked to Iran and the IRGC. And of course, the Houthis are one of those groups, as is Hamas. And we don't have a profile yet of the Houthis, but we hope to develop profiles. We don't have a profile of Hamas, I will say. We do of Hezbollah. And we also have lots of profiles of the many Iraqi groups that are in that orbit. And that reminds me that another of the alliances that al-Shabaab has is with AQAP. And so there's some concern about Yemen links to Somalia, given that they're not that far apart. So going forward, we are very interested. And you point also to another aspect of all this. When does a group become so strong that it's state-like, as opposed to saying that it's a rebel group, an insurgent group, which seems to minimize? And I don't quite know how to take that into account, although it's a reality of the problem.
Other CSAC fellows? Next to Harold? No?
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I'm Max, a computer science postdoc here at CSAC and the Center for AI Safety. I was wondering, regarding the research questions of that talk, do you think we could learn something from these terrorist insurgencies and drug cartels, or vice versa? But they have different final goals, like one more ideological, the other one more money and profit driven. they still have the same instrumental goals in between, right? No competition, military control, local terrorism, stuff like that. Thank you.
You want to try that one?
Sure. So great question. Drug cartels are fascinating actors and major players in some parts of the world. They're often excluded from these sorts of data analyses because of the exact reason that you raised. They often don't have any sort of like political component. So in terms of coding the groups in UCDP, they don't have an incompatibility with the government is kind of the baseline expectation. They have recently added some of the Mexican cartels to UCDP, but that's a relatively recent addition. So I think a kind of typical Civil War scholar might say like, oh, you know, they're different. We shouldn't worry about them. But I think it's really interesting that these groups are probably very transnational, and they might actually have more transnational interests than insurgencies do, especially if they're part of some sort of like international crime network, because I mean, their interests are to, if they're trying to maximize profit, they probably have an interest in moving abroad and kind of building relationships abroad. So I appreciate your point. I think the theory kind of could extend to those cases. Unfortunately, it's difficult to kind of test them. I think we'd have to think about whether or not we would expect something different given the absence of political objectives. I think that would be kind of the only thing that we might have to think about, but definitely an interesting kind of case that we could move to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's go to Jim and then Harold. Jim Goldgar.
Thank you. Yeah, Jim Goldgar, visiting scholar here at CSAC. And just as a side note, when I came here 2 years ago, I went into Martha Crenshaw's old office and I had to unplug the phone because you're very popular and nobody's trying to call me on that phone, but they are
Why
trying
didn't
to.
you answer?
I answered. I answered once and then I unplugged the phone.
I hope
so-
I didn't threaten you.
Like Max mentioned profit, so maybe my question's related. I'm not really sure. When you talked about publicity and propaganda, I was interested that you didn't mention fundraising or recruitment, and I was just wondering if those were understood when you were saying publicity, or if those are other things. Those seems to me like those would be reasons for doing this, but I noticed that it didn't come up, so I was just curious about that.
I think somewhere at some point it was in the slides, so it could be that as we were going through editing everything, we put it out. Yes, obviously very important, especially the sort of reputational advantages in terms of both of these. And one part of this for al-Shabaab was recruitment of foreign fighters. And this was also something that was very controversial within the group, whether or not to bring in foreign fighters. And this was part of the internationalization of al-Shabaab. The contributions of the foreign fighters, you know, as you know, it's debated as to whether they're that much of a contribution to a real insurgency or a terrorist campaign. But the bomb makers, they did bring in instructors from al-Qaeda, and that was one reason for the increase in their sophistication in terms of building bombs. And they also may have learned from al-Qaeda the kind of notion of the two-step attack. They explode a car bomb, say outside the perimeter of a base, and then when everybody reacts to that, then they go in with an armed assault, which is also possibly due to this increased recruitment. Recruitment within Somalia, I'm not sure whether the alliances aid that so much as recruitment outside among diaspora communities, for example, in Kenya. But again, raising again that question of why Kenya and not other neighboring countries that also have minorities. My understanding is that there were pre-existing networks in Kenya that made it more promising as an area to move into. But yes, definitely it can be an asset on both those fronts.
Harold?
Thanks. Harold Trincudas, Deputy Director here at CSAC. Thank you for the talk. Super interesting. I wonder if you so follows up maybe a little bit on Jim's question, but in the way you presented the ties or the alliances of the groups, you focused sort of on the military wings of the groups. And I'm wondering to what extent you've thought of, or maybe if you're able to look at, how the internationalization of financial networks to provide support for these groups might lead to these connections. And of course, the case I'm thinking about is Hezbollah operating out of Paraguay to launch two attacks on Paris in the early 1990s, which is related to financial networks, links to diasporic communities, which you just mentioned, that enable them to conduct those kinds of attacks. So, and as an aside to Katie's point, the foreign policy of Brazilian and Mexican organized crime is actually a fascinating and growing topic. So,
Do you have a response, or?
I mean, if you have a data set, I'm happy to take it. I think that's really important. And maybe it's a component of the international ties, like what that is actually doing for the groups that we should highlight more, that it is kind of allowing, maybe these connections are partly financial, and we should take that more into account in the theory. I worry that we'll have trouble measuring it, but perhaps our next case could be like Hezbollah, or a group that has these sorts of ties, and we can kind of trace how they develop over time and how they influence the internationalization of the group's goals and kind of broader objectives and enemies. Yeah.
And I'll add that I had thought of Hezbollah when we were thinking of what are some cases. I just think of things that come to my mind from my background, and Hezbollah's attacks in Argentina, and then I believe it was in Bulgaria that they attacked Israeli tourists in Bulgaria. And so and again, we take them outside the Middle East. We get away from where are the borders here to clearly transplanting themselves to a distant location, and how financial networks might play into that. And you're mentioning that makes me think and remember that in what I've been reading about al-Shabaab, and again, there are lots of articles trying to explain their international focus, I don't see anybody mentioning that, and that's sort of odd. And also, again, just as a footnote, we did do some work, I think, on the Mexican cartels some years ago. We never really pushed it as far as we could have, but we definitely thought we could apply the kind of framework we had to criminal groups and their relationships, as well as to political groups. Again, Mapping Militants is concerned with interactions, rivalries, alliances, splits, mergers, and also internal organizational processes and factors. We look at who their allies are. Do they have foreign state sponsors? Do they have good relationships with local communities? Trying to locate them in a larger ecosystem than just considering them to be separated from their environments.
Very good. Rose and then Scott.
I'm back to the abroad question. Because Martha, you bringing up the PLA worked together with the Red Brigades back in the 60s and 70s. These attacks in Uganda are horrific, but it's more like a regional game rather than a big game on a big stage. Munich Olympics, 1970. So is there a there in some ways that the big game doesn't exist anymore, and I suppose that's a good thing at the moment, or not, or is it just lurking beneath the surface and bound to come at us at some point?
That's a really good question, and it is very curious. Certainly, some arguments have been that al-Shabaab wants to be a regional African power, not just even East Africa, but an African power, and that they aren't necessarily thinking beyond that, which would be sort of an argument against saying, well, they're just a tool of al-Qaeda, because if they were. However, there's a very curious little event that I don't know all the ins and outs of, and if anybody here does, please let me know what you can. But apparently there was a plot by al-Qaeda to launch a 9/11 style attack against the United States. And an indictment was handed down, and it was sealed, and it was unsealed in, I believe, 2019. So I try to figure out what happens. The indictment is quite vague about exactly the nature of the plot, not very specific at all. But so I'm trying to figure it out. And all I know is that there was a status conference. The guy's in jail here. He was extradited from the Philippines. So I thought, is that an indication that al-Shabaab was trying to move beyond and indeed imitate al-Qaeda, which would be sort of probably not a good tactical move, really. But and in the Philippines too, you know, with all of that association, and I don't know what to make of that, but there was a little hint. And then there's the attack on the American troops in Kenya. They're not really directly attacked, certainly American troops outside. And it's not clear to me, however, that they meant to kill Americans. I realize that sounds like quibbling, but they might not have meant to. They just attacked this base. It is a Kenyan base. Americans are there. You say, well, surely they knew that. But we always, you know, we can't assume that they did. They might not have. And, you know, there's not been a major foreign attack since, which is also kind of curious and interesting to me. So I don't know whether they have broader aspirations and they're unable to actualize them, or whether they're really smartly sticking to their regional ambitions. It's interesting, they've had the same leader for a long time. That too, continuity, despite all the turmoil I've talked about, the last leader who's so far survived American strikes has been in power for a number of years. So in other words, there's continuity, and maybe he doesn't want to move to something. You know, the risk you incur by attacking more broadly now is pretty high. And again, the perpetrator of the attack in 2020, it took the U.S. 3 years, but he's gone now. So that might also be a little discouraging to them. So, do you have any more? Ed? Nope.
Do you go back to the slide that had civilians being killed at home and abroad?
Oh, yeah. This one?
Yeah. So I was thinking that there may be like a Willie Sutton argument. Willie Sutton famously said, well, when asked, why do you rob banks? So that's where the money is.
Yep.
Why would you attack civilians abroad? Because that's where the civilians of the interveners or the people who are supporting your side. Killing your own civilians is one strategy, but killing the intervener strategy is an effort to try to get them out. That's a pretty simplistic argument. What's wrong with it?
Well, for one thing, there isn't a substitution effect there either. They have killed large numbers of civilians and pretty constantly.
You see it at home, yeah.
Yeah, so you can see that they're attacking at home. And on some occasions, they've incurred a backlash among Somalis when they've done this. They've killed like up to, say, 100 people. There's one attack that killed apparently and injured something like 500 in Mogadishu. But I thought, well, that will discourage them from attacking at home. And of course, one of my first thoughts of, well, duh, of course, they don't attack foreign militaries in Somalia because it's hard. They're well fortified. These are hard targets. You want to get soft targets, you go abroad. But they're not, as you can see, they're doing both. They're doing both all the time. And they still are.
They're only doing both recently. They were doing both, but
Well, so this
three
is,
times as many in 1990 and 2000 for most of the period.
yeah.
It's mostly
Well, this is all, so this is all groups. This is not just Al-Shabaab. Yeah. And we think that's kind of driven by these like large jihadist networks that are growing. So like the Islamic State, for example, just kind of has more players that can attack abroad. And that's why we think there's an increase. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the overall, but it is interesting because as you know, that would be the first thing you'd think. Well, there aren't any Kenyan civilians to speak of, but another kind of, not quite the same thing, but close, would be attacks on embassies, foreign embassies. There are a few of those, but not as many as I might expect. And some of the attacks that you might think it was directed at an embassy, it's really not clear because the reports that we get, again, open source literature is, well, a car bomb exploded near the Ethiopian embassy, for example. You don't know whether that was the target or just maybe that embassy is right in the middle of Mogadishu, and so that was where the bomb happened to go off. But I mean, I think that's valid. But the thing is that they might do that, but they attack civilians at home as well. My feeling, I guess I could even say I would argue it, is that this is part of the Al-Qaeda affiliation, is these attacks on civilians, particularly non-believer civilians. But they haven't always been careful to distinguish between the enemy, Christian enemy, and the Muslim and Muslim populations. They've killed a lot of Muslims as well. But I think it is the case that when they got backlash within Somalia, they started trying to discriminate a little bit more, but they don't entirely. If their aim is to do that, they take a lot of risks in killing just. And like I say, I looking at their pattern, I thought that when they got extreme backlash from these major attacks that killed large numbers of civilians years ago, that you'd see them stop doing it, but they have continued to do it. And I'm not sure this, of course, is all groups. And of course, it doesn't tell you whether how many casualties there were in the attack. Was it a really major attack? Was it one of these, a minor attack? Not that any death isn't a tragedy, but that the ones that kill 100 people do tend to get more publicity for the group. It's an interesting sort of dynamic. I think Harold has a one finger, two finger.
Okay, got you on the queue. I have myself next, and then Ken up here. So yeah, well, okay. So I'm going to fold together a couple online questions, one from Mary Steiner and one from Graham Davies. And maybe you just answered this, but I mean, the one thing that jumped out for me here is this 30% of groups is really, I would not have guessed it was that high.
Yeah.
Did you have a time series plot?
Yeah, this is the number of
Yeah,
groups.
okay.
Yeah.
So the percentage would be interesting, but okay, so what I was wondering was how much is this a phenomenon of, it's been some years, but when I was looking at similar data, I was really struck by how the last 10, 15, even 20 years, almost all the action in terms of new groups is in Islamist groups in North Africa, Middle East, and that's really been the driver. And maybe, I don't know if you've tried it. It would be interesting maybe to partial out how much is that, like that's really where we see this, or do we see internationalization of non-Islamist groups attacks also? I'd be curious about that. And also regionally, I mean, do you see this in other regions as well, or is it really very much this region? Mary Steiner asks, are we talking about Wahhabi educated supported groups? Is it Shia Sunni? I mean, the Al Qaeda Islamic State's very Sunni, but do we also see? Have the Iranian supported groups just been doing the same thing they've always been doing, or are they doing more of this over time? Curious about in what parts of this are, I don't know, some kind of a trend of the world, and how much is it like, well, it's is Sunni Islamist groups. So yeah, let me leave it at that. Graham asked, why are you starting in 1989? And that can also tie in. I assume it's because that's when your data starts. But
yeah, that's when the UCDP GED starts. Yeah. So the first cut of this project actually used the global terrorism database to measure transnational attacks, but it wasn't quite getting at the insurgency element of things, because a lot of those groups are much smaller. They only commit one attack. They don't live very long. So that's why I switched over, but we lost a lot of data. So yeah, these are all really great suggestions. We haven't parceled it out kind of at the kind of group identity level. We do in the regression include like Islamist groups.
And it's big.
Yeah, exactly. So that suggests that there's something going on. And so I think as a next step, we need to think about the identities of these groups, where they are, and kind of like what explains this change over time. Is it happening only in one particular region? Yeah.
As you know, it's hard to get data that is time series data with these groups and their activities. And also, I will harp on the failed and foiled aspect of it, in part because I did some work on that when I was with an earlier DHS-supported consortium at the University of Maryland. And we did a lot of work on trying to track down failed and foiled plots, because we said you can't have a notion of a group's strategy, its intentions, even its capabilities, without knowing about the attacks that failed. And there are a fairly significant number of al-Shabaab major attacks that failed from what I can find out. It's not easy. You've got to sit down and just pour through the local press really to find this sort of thing. So we're hoping going forward that we would be able to do some of this, which should give you just a better picture of what was going on. Is it an artifact of, for example, the spread of Sunni jihadism and of more and more groups that are Sunni jihad, and thus by nature, origin, identity, purpose, everything attracted to spreading the mission, spreading the faith, spreading Al-Qaeda type of ideology, Wahhabism, or whichever strain and obviously a lot of different strains mixed in there. And I don't think we're able to discover that yet, except by going, I guess, through a case study method where we could find some other cases that would show that this same sort of dynamic would operate in a different kind of ideological belief, identity context. But I think it is telling. A third, that is a lot. That's a fairly large number of groups that are, and it remains an important question. I think the problem is, how do you get at why groups? And you have a group like Al-Shabaab that from its origins, from its very beginnings, was inclined toward Al-Qaeda. There were Salafists within Al-Shabaab apparently who they thought in effect that revolution at home would be sufficient, and they didn't support any kind of internationalization. And I would say we'd need to know more about those debates that went on within the group. So the local versus transnational debate is going to occur even within Sunni jihadist movements. So it's not that it's never there, it is there. And it's constantly there with Al-Shabaab, it's probably still there. Moving outside, again, we need to find a wider range of examples that would show that it's not just this kind of association, which would be the simple explanation for what's going on. At the same time, I think we'll find variation among the Sunni jihadist movement. So even if that's what we looked at, that particular cluster, I think we're going to see variation with the groups in terms of their inclination to regional expansion and to international expansion, which, you know, that's a very good question. What makes them really want to go far to get the far enemy, as opposed to, you'd say, well, sure, Kenya, well, that's just right across the border, and Ethiopia, these are bordering states. It's not that hard. It's within Africa. And one of you asked, is it just Africa? Is it going to go outside? All of that we need to expand. These are massive data collection efforts. So when you rely on databases that other people have collected, you have to follow their rules in the scope of what they collect. But to collect it yourself, I will say, it's a massive undertaking. And if I may offer a comment on government agencies aren't always really eager to spend a lot of money collecting data. That I will say from experience. They do sometimes, but often you'd say, well, 5 years from now, I'm going to have a spectacular database that will include failed and foiled attacks around the world. And that's a long time to be out there collecting nitty-gritty sorts of data. However, I will say encouragingly, there's more interest in it. There was a recent attack on failed and foiled suicide attacks by, I think, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab. So there's growing interest in that, and that might tell us more about what's going on. There could be groups out there that they tried to make this sort of move, and none of the big plans ever really transpired. So we think of them as not having tried to reach abroad. It's just because we didn't see what they were doing. So there's a lot of puzzles still out there.
We're going to go to Ken, but just on one follow-up or two finger on this, like I guess one possible example of internationalization outside of Islamist Sunni groups might be international criminal gangs, and which I do think have expanded their. You know, we see much more extensive international operations in the Western Hemisphere, but not only, and that's probably partly technology, right?
Yeah, it's easier.
Yeah, easier. Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, so I had a question about the empirics and some suggestions maybe. So I think a natural question that you're going to face is that international, what is that international ties variable actually picking up, and how causal is it? Like, so you're kind of telling a causal story where making these alliances with international groups could actually cause you to attack more abroad. But clearly there could be some pre-existing desire to go international that leads you to develop these ties. And so kind of figuring out, is it a cause or is it an effect, would be an important thing to do. It seems to me like one natural thing that you could add to your regression models would be capturing some of the motives to go abroad. Like, are there foreign troops operating in your country? Are there diaspora groups in other countries? And so those are the two that pop to mind immediately. You could also think about, like, I mean, a little reluctant, but is there some kind of dyadic analysis where you could actually, like, where do they attack?
Yeah.
And you could think about there's distance would be an obvious control there, but then if you actually had the target locations, you could does this country have troops in your country, or is there a diaspora in this country?
Right.
It just seemed to be a way to kind of pick up some more of that variation.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I totally agree. We cannot make a causal claim, and I hope we did not try to do so. I think those two things are related. And so basically, when we were looking at the Al-Shabaab case, I was wondering maybe if, like, so the formal Al-Qaeda affiliation happens in 2012, but the Kampala attack, the first attack abroad, happens in 2010. And after 2010, I think the next year is like 45 attacks abroad or something. It's something like 10% of the group's activity is abroad that year. And so I was wondering, maybe Al-Shabaab, like, working to get Al-Qaeda's attention, or like doing some sort of like signaling to try to get Al-Qaeda to say, okay, you can be a formal affiliate. I didn't find any evidence for that. But because it seems like the kind of Al-Qaeda push predates a lot of that activity, that doesn't quite address the concern that these kind of these groups are kind of predisposed to go abroad first. But I think it suggests that there's something about this tie that, like, is translating to activity abroad, and maybe the desire, we can't disentangle that, but it's something about logistics, it's something about benefits, it's something is happening basically. But we need to, I think more deeply about, like, kind of the causal chain, and if we can actually show any of that. So I tried to find data on foreign troops, and it was like really spotty, and dropped a bunch of observations because I think it was only conflict years or something. So I need to do more on that. I was thinking about coding up some of the military balance stuff that I used for the Somalia case. The diaspora groups is a really good idea. The dyadic stuff. So there's not a huge literature on transnational attacks, but most of it is thinking about which states will be targets. And so there's like some work that says like democracies are going to be greater targets just because they get bigger propaganda value kind of stuff. So it would be interesting to think about how we can kind of take those state level attributes and like apply our group level explanations, because I think that would be probably the contribution we could make.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's really hard to distinguish cause or effect. And with Al-Shabaab, you see both things happening really, because for reasons that probably have to do with the presence of Afghan war veterans in the early iterations of what became Al-Shabaab. The fact that Al-Qaeda in East Africa before bin Laden moved to Afghanistan, very active in Somalia. We all know Black Hawk Down, the 1990s period, and that Al-Qaeda always claimed that he was responsible for driving the Americans out of Somalia. So there were always both of these sorts of connections going on for quite a long time. It's really difficult to sort it all out. And as Katie says, there is a fair amount of literature on the state level variables that would make certain countries attractive targets, publicity, diasporas. And one argument that we ran across was that the very major attacks in Somalia, outside Somalia, for example, in Kenya or Uganda or Ethiopia or Djibouti or elsewhere, were meant to persuade these populations to pressure the government to pull out. Of course, it never worked, because that original attack on Uganda, ostensibly to force Uganda to pull out, actually led to more foreign intervention. So they weren't learning really fast about that. But the corollary argument is the minor attacks, of which there are many, many, many more, were meant to provoke Kenyan repression. And so Kenya has security forces that are fairly able and capable, but they tend to be indiscriminate. And so it provoked repression against Muslims and therefore increased support for al-Shabaab and its various networks and confederates within Kenya. And of course, we've not introduced that kind of distinction either. But there is a fair amount of literature on what makes certain target states more attractive, more vulnerable. But again, an interesting facet of it to me is that it doesn't seem to have paid off. The number of foreign troops is what is up to 20,000, and the number of states involved has grown all the time. So everything they're doing is not working. They don't appear to be learning from this, but they're still hanging in there. Al-Shabaab is still one of the strongest groups out there, and probably Katie was asking me about this, and I think they're probably one of the strongest Al-Qaeda affiliates that's out there. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic. There may be some hubris involved, but what is curious to me is that since 2020 or so, they seem to have backed off some on their foreign attacks. Now, again, let me throw in, it takes a long time to plan these attacks. They could be planning a spectacular that will happen tomorrow, and it will change our expectations about what they did and what they're likely to do moving forward. But it makes it all very difficult.
We're going to go to Caleb, but on al-Shabaab, it suddenly struck me that isn't a puzzle. There's probably an easy answer, but so isn't al-Shabaab's real kind of their big enemy there is Ethiopia. Ethiopia, they're the backers of the regime they're trying to overthrow. Do they attack? And there's lots of Somalis in Ogaden. I don't know if al-Shabaab is a different clan or something from Ogaden, but do they attack in Ethiopia? I've never heard of it.
They have, and there have been some failed and foiled attempts in Ethiopia as well. But two interesting things there. It's a really good question. Why not a country other than Kenya that also has a Muslim minority that might also be provoked into repression against that minority if you needle them with attacks. But of course, Ethiopia is not getting along so well with the Somali government these days. So there's a factor there. They're all quarreling over Somaliland and the coast, apparently, with Ethiopia saying they've made a deal with Somaliland and the Somali government objecting to it. But yes, why not more attacks in Ethiopia, which was the first intervener after all? And there have been attacks, but my first answer would be that they had networks in Kenya that they did not have in Ethiopia. And the particular historical explanation for that, I don't get to it. I haven't gotten to it yet, but my understanding is that there were long-standing. You might come back and say, well, of course, there were those attacks on Israeli tourists, for example, in Kenya after 9/11 by Al-Qaeda. But apparently, Al-Qaeda sent operatives from the center to perform those attacks. Al-Shabaab was not involved in them, at least from what I can find from the literature that I was reading. But one explanation I did read was that there's just more press active in Kenya. What happens in Kenya gets more publicity than what happens in Ethiopia. And so just if you want to make a big impression, be headlines in The Guardian and France 24 and the New York Times, that Kenya is a better spot for that. Now, I will also add that those of us who analyze these groups probably attribute more rationality to their decisions than they are using. Just always a caution. And we tend to interpret cause. We interpret cause in terms of effect. They had this effect, therefore they must have meant to. Always try to guard against that.
All right, Kaitlyn.
Okay, so that actually segues perfectly to my question. So my question is kind of motivated by Ken's point on the motivation to go abroad. And that's exactly my question. Is I wonder if it just makes a bigger psychological splash. I'm thinking back to your own incredible psychological work, Martha, on the psychology of terrorism. And the talk really focused on kind of almost rational reasons for why the attacks might be easier to conduct. Instrumentally, you can pool capabilities, you can share knowledge. But if the ultimate goal of these attacks is to, strike fear in some foreign observer, or you get some political reaction, I just wonder if you've looked at the the foreign observer reaction to these different types of attacks.
Did you have a two-finger, Harold? You want to add into
Just
that?
I think following up
before
on
we enforce
Kayla's
it?
point,
Yeah.
I meant to ask about the role of surprise and whether the surprise of attacking abroad is appealing because of the psychological effect in terms of terrorizing civilian populations, but also the outbidding factor. You know, look at us, we can actually attack in Uganda or wherever, Buenos Aires, which people don't expect.
Yeah.
So that surprise factor might be make it extra.
Part of it. Yes, I think so. I think if we did a little measure of press coverage of attacks, and that would be possible to do, just take a little more work, more research assistance, that an attack in, say, Mogadishu that kills 100 people will not get as much publicity as an attack in Kampala that kills 100 people or Nairobi that kills 100 people. And that just is the way it is in terms of international interest, that we audiences are going to be more affected by something that happens outside. If we think of terrorism as aimed at people thinking, I could be next. Well, Nairobi today, who knows what tomorrow, could be New York, even if that is an exaggeration of their capabilities. So I think they're quite well aware of that, yes. And they, at least we from our understanding, they're quite well aware of that calculation. And yes, Harold, part of it is surprise, although over time, the first attack in Kampala was, it got enormous amounts of publicity, and it was a surprise. I think everybody was quite shocked, despite the intervention and despite al-Shabaab issuing threats all the time to do this. But now that it happens with some regularity, then are we so surprised? Are we still surprised? I'm not sure. But yes, initially, when you weren't, you can see that it would have that kind of shock value. Does it still have shock value? And then, of course, outbidding. I've thought of that as well, but al-Shabaab didn't really have a rival within Somalia that you could say they were trying to outdo by moving abroad and escalation. And there's, as I'm sure most of you know, quite a lot of arguments about the outbidding theories. Is there really outbidding in extremism? Do they really try to escalate in order to gain it? Is there really competitive escalation, as it's also called it? Or does it work the other way? Do some groups think, oh, look, I don't want to go that far. Look at all the people they alienated. Look at the fact that they brought the U.S. into the struggle in around 2017 or so. Maybe I don't want to go that route. So you see both things going on. But al-Shabaab, it has sometimes had some small rivals within Somalia. They've been very clever about it. They merge with them, and then they drive those guys out as dissidents. They purge them from the organization, so they remove internal dissent. It's actually, if it is a deliberate and clever move on their part, it has worked quite well. They have gobbled up 3 or 4 smaller groups that way.
Further questions?
Let me just ask
Oh,
one.
yeah, Norman.
Very quick,
And
very
then Eva.
quickly, I mean, this discussion.
Oh, well, hold on one second. So we get the.
Yes, my name is Norman Naymark. I'm at CSAC. This discussion, I keep thinking about the United States as a target of terrorism. Is the reason, in your estimation, that we're not the target of terrorism or haven't been since 9/11 and the aftermath, is because of the active, defense of the country by Homeland Security? Are we just lucky, or is there a reason that people like al-Shabaab don't want to do this kind of thing?
I think it has to be a combination of things. I think we are more effective in counterterrorism over the years, intelligence in particular. And that's never to say it couldn't happen. I don't want to say that we should ever be complacent. It could still happen, but I think we've certainly gotten better, more alert to possibilities. I always fear that we will turn our attention again to interstate rivalries, to China, et cetera, and neglect terrorism. This happens periodically. Then capabilities. I always think of Mearsheimer's theory about the stopping power of water. all the realists among us, I'm sure, are familiar with that theory. That it's just really hard to launch attacks across large bodies of water, even with technology.
But if Al-Shabaab wanted to develop Somali networks in the U.S., they could.
This is a diaspora.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a diaspora, very closely watched. There were some Somalis who traveled as semi-foreign fighters to Somalia. I would say that there was certainly suspicion that they would be an active network, but mostly they were more inclined, I think, to foreign fighters. And if some of you are familiar with the work of Thomas Heckhammer, who's also been here at CSAC, he argued that the people who want to attack at home versus the people who want to go and fight abroad are different people. One's not a substitution for the other. But yes, there are diasporas here as well. Why they don't? I still think it's logistically more difficult, and a lot of things are more difficult in the country now. Even if you go back to the Oklahoma City bombing, we began to crack down on, for example, your ability to make explosives at home. And a number of things have changed, some of which were just not quite so obvious as some more striking counterterrorism measures, like making you put all your liquids in a quart bag.
Maybe last question, Eva. We've got to get your
My name is Eva Meyerson-Milgram, and I'm an emerita from Stanford. And I just want to ask, I'm coming from the finance direction. What does that have to do with anything going transnational and not? Do you have any thoughts about that, where you get the money from? Because money trail seems to be really, really effective in trying to understand who you can recruit, maybe even when you do your events and so on.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Katie? Or
well, it seems like financing has been maybe a theme of some of the comments that have come up. So I think it signals to me and Martha that we need to think more deeply about the role that it plays. Yeah, I mean, it probably maps on to like networks, and in terms of like the types of people you have abroad, the types of ability to access resources, to move resources, and that kind of directly captures, I think, what we're trying to say about the importance of other types of ties, not just financial ties, but like reputational ties, ideological ties, military ties. And so I guess to answer your question, I think it's important. And we need to think more deeply about what role it kind of interacts with the ties that we're talking about, and then how to measure it.
Because you talked about the media network.
Yeah.
And I was sitting and wondering
what the question about finance first and then Kenya. It's a really very good question. And if one could get the data, if one could track how much money Al-Shabaab is getting, and then track that against when they launch these more ambitious attacks abroad. So if I were going to pursue that, what I would do is I would look at the impact of their losses of revenue, because those are sort of blips that you could pinpoint. So when they lost the port city of Kismayo, which from maybe 2011, and when they lost control of Mogadishu, they lost some of their sources of finances and fundings. So do we see a lull in these more ambitious attacks after they've lost this? My understanding is that Al-Shabaab is mostly self-funded. They may be one of these groups like the Algerian groups that were going to be sources of money for Al-Qaeda rather than vice versa. But that would be a very interesting sort of thing that one could at least roughly track. And I myself was interested in these, what were clearly losses in Somalia and what effect they had. Did they lead to, did the weakness theory hold, and so they launch attacks abroad because they're losing at home? Or does it mean they don't have the resources to attack abroad, because what they've lost a lot of is their financial base? What I understand is that Al-Shabaab still controls a lot of territory and a lot of people. They impose revolutionary taxes and all the normal ways that such groups extract money from populations that they control. They have some support among warlords, some clan support. Al-Shabaab always tried to transcend clan rivalries, but nobody's ever completely successful with doing that. So that's another source of funding for them. So one could get at that a little bit. And I've now forgotten the second part of your question. It went beyond, oh, you said why Kenya? Why did they have the Kenyan networks? There had apparently been groups that were sympathetic to Al-Qaeda in Kenya from way back from when bin Laden was in Sudan. So going back to the 1990s, there were these very, I won't say ineffective, but fairly small groups without a great deal of influence as to what was going on. And apparently part of Al-Shabaab's strategy, part of one of the reasons for attacking Kenya and mounting these attacks was to encourage recruitment into these networks so that you could have kind of, if not a standalone, at least a very useful subsidiary within Kenya composed of Kenyan Muslims who have been sort of in a way driven into the arms of Al-Shabaab, but also inspired by these big publicity getting attacks. So that's one of the audiences too, is Kenyan Muslims. And as we know, mostly it's going to be young men who are recruited into the Al-Shabaab ranks. But my understanding is that you have Al-Shabaab operatives who are in Kenya, and then you have Kenyans who are part of what was not completely autonomous, but more autonomous than not. And in fact, it was regarded as significant that one of the most recent suicide attacks within Kenya was by a Kenyan national and not by a Somali national, meaning that it could be that one of Al-Shabaab's aims is to encourage a domestic insurgency within Kenya. And imagine what effect that would have if there were a really serious, and there are lots of complexities there.
Yeah, a Kenyan national of Somali origin or not?
No, just a Kenyan, yeah, not. There are a lot of ethnic Somalis within Kenya as well as other, and this is supposed to be something that could, a group, someone on their own, you could have a group on its own, not just Somalis whose identity might be with Somalia rather than with Kenya. So, I think they represent a real danger on that front which I've argued before in other forums that that's as much of a danger to our national security as direct attacks on the U.S.
All right, well, great way to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great question.